So you'd had a few health problems, hadn't you?
Yeah.
This?
The main one obviously was the weight, and in turn the consequences, the social consequences of being fat, etc. Not too many friends growing up and that sort of thing, and so you sort of retreat from the world and you develop sort of indoor solo habits like books and video games and all that sort of thing, and that's where the nerd side of the persona comes in, I suppose. Other health issues, as I was at my worst, at my heaviest, sort of early stages of 2015, I'm starting to deal with issues of mobility. At my heaviest, I would have to, in order to tie my shoelaces, I would have to grab my stomach with both hands and sort of shift it to one side so that I could then lean around it and then down, having lifted my leg up to some sort of mid-height, a stool or a chair or something, so that I could reach down and tie my shoelace on one foot and then swap it around, move my stomach around to the other side, lean around that, and, so I could reach down and tie the other shoelace. So that was physically as bad as it got. There was some chest pain that was starting to creep in, on and off, and I was in and out of doctors and hospitals, ED departments, getting that looked at. Generally, though, when people would test me for things, and they never really told me much about what they were testing me for, though I did find out later, they couldn't really find much on the surface that would indicate there was anything much wrong with me beyond that I was just very visibly fat. I later found out when I got a copy of those tests myself that I was very chronically inflamed. My CRP was into 3 digits at one point, which is really, really high. Yes. My glucose was slightly elevated, but wasn't considered to be excessively. My cholesterol was slightly elevated, but again, not excessively. Blood pressure only slightly above normal, not full on hypertensive. The main thing for me was the very visible issue of the fat, and later I found out there's some issues of chronic inflammation under the hood as well. So yeah, all up, it really wasn't a very happy place to be.
Interesting. They would have tested your triglycerides, which gives quite a bit of insight into your insulin resistance. And
yeah, triglycerides were never that high, and HDL wasn't really all that low. If you take a look at those numbers now, and they might be considered sort of about average, unremarkable. They could be better, but they could be a lot worse. I think my trigs were about 1 millimole or something, and HDL was about the same. So both can be a lot worse than that. Both can be better, but they weren't seen as being anything worth worrying about at the time. They're a lot better now, of course. My trigs these days sort of hover about the 0.6 mark, right. And my HDL is typically well over 2. Yeah. So yeah, those signs are well improved. Glucose is now completely normal. Blood pressure is now completely normal.
And they would never have tested insulin. It's still, even now, it's really hard to get people tested for insulin, but they would never have tested you for insulin back then. And that could have been a really good indicator of why your blood glucose and HbA1c was so normal. And then we do know that some people can get, apologies for the word, but some people can get very fat without excessive metabolic derangement, whereas, other people can only gain a tiny bit of fat and they end up with type 2 diabetes. So there's that individual aspect.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's a lot of that around, and that's perhaps part of the reason why this whole idea of insulin resistance is perhaps hard for some people in positions of authority to perhaps buy into, because you get such a wide, disparate set of symptoms. You think about someone like a Robert Lustig, for example, who talks about people who can be metabolically healthy and obese, while at the same time, at the other end of what is quite a broad bell curve, you have your tophies, thin on the outside, fat on the inside, and obviously everybody in between. And it is really interesting to sort of try and unpack those various combinations of symptoms that people can experience, and the fact that they can all be tied back to this underlying physiological state of insulin resistance. I kind of like to use a balloon analogy when I talk about, how it is that things can manifest so differently in different people, yet have the same underlying root cause. And what I mean by the balloon analogy is that when you inflate a balloon to a point where it bursts, where does it burst? The answer will vary from balloon to balloon, but wherever it does burst, it does so at its weakest point. So some people will be predisposed to weight gain. Some people will be predisposed to, if their pancreas isn't strong enough to produce enough insulin to keep the blood sugar under control, then they become diabetic, for example. If people's kidneys start to get affected by the insulin resistance, you start to retain sodium, and there's blood pressure starts to become an issue. People can get dyslipidemic. We've already talked about that. Cholesterol goes out of whack. But they all have their own pathways, if you like, that when you follow them back upstream, all lead back to this issue of insulin resistance. But as you say, we tend not to have talked about it so much in years past.